The evening crept over the town like a slow poison, turning the streets into narrow veins of inky blackness. In the flickering glow of the street lamps, the air was dense, suffocating, as though something unseen held its breath. Among the usual noises of the night, dogs barking in the distance, the faint hum of traffic, there was something else. Something that whispered beneath the surface, something alive, crawling just out of sight. Martha closed the door to her small house, setting the lock with a metallic click. She'd lived in this town all her life, and yet, tonight, something felt different. It had started with a shadow she noticed on the way home, a shadow that did not match the shape of anything around it. It had slithered along the pavement like a snake made of pure darkness, its form stretching and contracting unnaturally, darting between lampposts and buildings. No matter how fast she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling it was following her. She hurried through her small living room, drawing the curtains shut and turning on every light she could. But no matter how bright the bulbs burned, there was always a corner of the room that seemed to resist the light, an awkward patch of darkness lingering just out of reach. It clung to the walls, stretched across the floor like oil, defying every rule of nature. With a cold shiver creeping up her spine, Martha walked toward the kitchen. Her hand shook as she filled a glass with water, the clink of ice cubes sounding too loud in the silence. But as she turned back toward the hallway, the glass slipped from her fingers, shattering into jagged shards on the floor. There, cast against the wall, was her shadow. No, not her shadow. It was something else. It moved when she did not, its form bloated, grotesque. The outline of its head was twisted, swollen with lumps that made it appear as though it were grinning. Long fingers scraped against the wall as it swayed, breathing, living. Martha stepped back, but the shadow slithered closer, detaching itself from the wall, spilling onto the floor like a puddle of pure black. It crawled up her legs before she could scream, cold and thick, gripping her like a suffocating second skin. Her breath caught in her throat, and her legs buckled under the weight of it as the darkness clung tighter, pressing against her chest, tightening with each frantic heartbeat. It whispered her name in a rasping voice, a voice made of broken glass and dead leaves, carried on a breath colder than death. She could feel its hunger, its bottomless pit of need. It wanted more than her life. It wanted to be her. She felt it writhing inside her skin, felt her own limbs bending unnaturally as though they belonged to someone or something else. In the mirror across the hallway, she caught a glimpse of her reflection, or what was supposed to be her reflection. Her eyes were wide with terror, but the shadow beneath her skin smiled. The edges of her face warped, curling into a grin too wide, too sharp, her teeth gleaming in the dim light like a predator's. And then, just as quickly as it came, the shadow retreated. It slipped off her body and disappeared into the corner, where the darkness was deepest. Martha collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, her skin cold and clammy, as if she'd just escaped drowning. But the shadow did not vanish. It lingered there, waiting, watching with patience that sent ice through her veins. Martha knew, deep inside, that it wasn't done with her. It would come back, and next time it would stay. Martha lay on the cold floor, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The room seemed to press in on her, the air thick with an almost tangible weight. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room where the shadow had retreated, but it was gone. Or, at least, it had blended so seamlessly into the darkness that she could no longer tell where the shadows of the room ended and it began. The lights in her house flickered, a dull buzz filling the air as if the electricity was failing. She scrambled to her feet, desperate to escape the suffocating silence. Her hands fumbled for her phone, her fingers slipping over the screen as she tried to dial anyone, anyone, who could help. But the screen remained black, dead. She cursed under her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't stay here, not with that thing lurking in the corners. She rushed to the front door, her breath catching as she gripped the doorknob, twisting it hard. It didn't budge. The lock, which she had so confidently secured earlier, now resisted her every attempt to open it. Her pulse quickened as she looked over her shoulder. The room behind her seemed to warp, the shadows bleeding into each other, stretching toward her like creeping fingers. The temperature plummeted, a chill so deep it gnawed at her bones. She heard again a whisper, "Martha." The voice crawled into her ears, its raspy tone like nails scraping along the inside of her skull. She pressed her hands to her head, shaking it violently, trying to force the sound out. But it only grew louder, more insistent. "Martha, let me in." Her blood turned to ice as she spun around, eyes wide with terror. The shadow was there, slithering across the floor, pooling at her feet. She staggered back, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Please." The voice pleaded, this time softer, more desperate. It sounded almost human, almost pitiful. But Martha knew better. She had seen the thing, felt its icy grip, and whatever it wasn't human. Not anymore. She stumbled backward into the hallway, her hands gripping the wall for support. The shadow followed her, twisting and contorting as it crept along the floor. It moved like liquid, oozing through the cracks and crevices of the house, as if it had always been there, waiting for this moment. Martha's mind raced as she searched for an escape. The windows. She darted toward the nearest one, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the latch. With a grunt, she managed to push it open, the cool night air rushing in, stinging her skin. She glanced down at the two-story drop beneath her. Her rational mind screamed at her not to do it, that it was too high, that she would break her legs or worse. But the darkness closing in behind her left no room for hesitation. She swung her legs over the windowsill, preparing to jump. And then she froze. Her reflection in the window, no, not her reflection, was smiling back at her. The shadow, still clinging to her, had infected even the glass. Its grin stretched unnaturally wide, eyes black as pitch, watching her with a hunger that made her stomach churn. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had become her. Or, at least it was trying to. "You can't run," it whispered through gritted teeth. "You belong to me now." Martha felt the icy grip of terror wrapping around her heart. She wanted to jump, to escape, but her body wouldn't move. Her limbs felt heavy, her muscles stiff and unresponsive. She was trapped, paralyzed by the very thing she was trying to flee. Behind her, the darkness surged forward, wrapping itself around her legs, pulling her back into the house. The window slammed shut with a deafening crash, glass splintering in every direction as Martha was dragged into the shadow's embrace. She screamed, thrashing against the invisible force, but it was no use. The shadow was inside her now, digging its claws deep into her mind. It whispered terrible things, visions of death and decay, of the countless souls it had devoured over centuries. She could feel them, writhing beneath her skin, clawing at her from the inside, begging to be freed. Her mind was fracturing, reality splintering into jagged fragments as the darkness consumed her. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. Martha lay on the floor, gasping for air, her vision blurred, her body trembling uncontrollably. The shadow was gone, but the silence that followed was not a relief. It was a suffocating, oppressive stillness that weighed on her like 1,000 pounds. She crawled to the mirror, her limbs weak, her breath shallow. When she looked at herself, the reflection was wrong. Her eyes were empty, her face gaunt, her skin pale and lifeless. And then, in the corner of the mirror, she saw it. The shadow. It was still there, lurking just behind her, waiting. And this time it smiled. Martha stared at her reflection, her mind teetering on the edge of sanity. Her body felt foreign, disconnected, as though she was merely a puppet dangling from invisible strings. The shadow had left something behind, something more than fear. It had left its mark inside her, a deep, gnawing presence that scratched at the edges of her consciousness, waiting to fully take over. In the days that followed, she tried to act normal, to go about her life as if nothing had happened. But every time she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror or in a shadow cast by the afternoon sun, she saw it. that grotesque, twisted reflection that no longer matched her own movements. The smile that wasn't hers. The eyes that were too dark, too empty. No one else noticed. Or maybe they did, and just didn't care. She tried to reach out to friends, to family, but something about her seemed to repel them. Her phone calls were avoided, her messages unanswered. It was as though she had become a ghost, slipping between the cracks of her own life. And the shadow, asterisk at asterisk, was always there just out of sight. When she walked down the street, she felt it trailing her, its presence pressing in on her from behind, lurking in every alley, under every flickering street lamp. At night, it seeped into her dreams, filling them with horrors beyond comprehension. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, her limbs tangled in the sheets, feeling as though something had been watching her as she slept. One evening, after another restless, sleepless night, Martha made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore, half alive, half consumed by something that wanted to devour her completely. She had to face it. She had to confront the shadow and end this nightmare, once and for all. She waited until nightfall, when the town was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and the shadows stretched long and deep. Steeling herself, she stepped outside, her breath visible in the cool air, every muscle in her body tense with anticipation. The streets were empty, eerily quiet. It felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. As she walked, she could feel it again, asterisk at asterisk, following her, slithering along the pavement, merging with every patch of darkness she passed. Her heart raced, but she didn't turn back. She knew it would be there. It was always there. She reached the edge of town, where the streetlights gave way to a dense patch of woods. The trees were ancient, gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The darkness here was thick, oppressive, almost alive. Martha hesitated for a moment, the weight of the forest pressing down on her, before stepping into the shadows. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper into the woods. The ground beneath her feet was soft and wet, the smell of damp earth filling her nostrils. The surrounding shadows shifted and twisted unnaturally, almost as if they were alive. But she kept walking, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then she saw it, standing in the clearing ahead, its form barely discernible in the darkness, was the shadow. But this time, it was no longer just a creeping silhouette. It had shape now, humanoid but distorted, grotesque. Its limbs were too long, its body hunched and twisted, its head tilted unnaturally, and from the darkness where its face should have been, a pair of gleaming eyes stared directly at her. For a moment, they stood in silence, facing each other, the cold wind howling through the trees. Martha's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stand tall, to confront this thing that had been tormenting her for so long. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. "Why won't you leave me alone?" The shadow didn't move at first. Then, slowly, its mouth, if you could call it that, twisted into that same awful grin she had seen in the mirror. It didn't speak, but its answer was clear in the way it moved toward her. Inch by inch, the darkness pooling at its feet, spreading out like a living thing. "I won't let you take me," Martha whispered, more to herself than to the creature. "I won't." She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the forest floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But the shadow was fast, faster than she could have ever imagined. It moved like smoke, swirling around the trees, closing the distance between them in seconds. She tripped, crashing hard to the ground, dirt and leaves flying into the air. When she tried to stand, the shadow was already upon her, wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. Cold tendrils of darkness slid over her skin, squeezing her chest, stealing the breath from her lungs. She clawed at the ground, trying to free herself, but the more she struggled, the tighter its grip became. And then she felt it. The shadow wasn't just wrapping around her, it was sinking into her, forcing its way inside her skin. It slid beneath her flesh, filling every pore, every vein, crawling up into her mind. Her body seized, her vision going black as the darkness consumed her from the inside out. For a brief moment, she thought she had died. But then, she opened her eyes. She was standing again, in the middle of the clearing, the cold wind biting at her skin. But something was wrong, horribly wrong. When she looked down, she saw the truth. The shadow wasn't gone. It was her. She raised her hands, trembling, but they were no longer hers. They were too long, too thin, black as night and dripping with darkness. Her reflection in the puddle at her feet was not the woman she had been. It was the shadow. It had taken her completely. And now, as it turned its new body toward the town, toward the people who had no idea what was coming, it grinned. It had a new vessel, and it was hungry. The last light flickered out in the distance, leaving only darkness behind.